We conduct research to advance the prosperity of all Washingtonians. That's sort of our byline and mission. As part of that, we promote state investments in broadly shared values, things like education and healthcare and a healthy environment. And alongside that, we promote an equitable and adequate revenue system, because that's necessary in order to make all of those important investments. So the budget context is an important one for the work that you're doing today, and I think probably for some of the conversations that you're going to be having later this afternoon. So hopefully I'm able to give you a little primer on the budget and the revenue system that might help inform your conversations this afternoon. So what I want to do is just cover three basic things. First, I'll talk a little bit about just the context and background on our state budget and our revenue system. Secondly, we'll look specifically at the budget situation for the next biennium, which we refer to as the 2015-17 biennium. That's the budget that lawmakers are in session right now, charged with writing that budget. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about the governor's proposal, which is the first proposal on the table to deal with the budget situation. So before I jump into a bunch of numbers and data, I think it's important to first ground us all in what the budget actually is. So I pose that question to all of you. What is the budget to you? Why is it important? Why did you choose to come to a budget session?
Because the budget's not sufficiently funded.
Okay.
It's a moral document.
Ooh, that laugh. Well, because there's a lot of hopes that are being bandied about, but there's also practical,
Also,
there's a lot of idealism, but we need to talk about what it's money and numbers.
Great.
It's a plan.
also referred to as our treasury. So we're all involved in this.
Great.
Our treasury.
And it's a plan for how we will spend that treasury.
Great.
It's our
Thank you.
priority system.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Those are great. There's no wrong answer, by the way. And mostly, I like to do that just to kind of take that step back and think about why this is important to all of us. And at the Budget and Policy Center, we see the budget as a reflection of priorities, as a reflection of values, and we actually distill all of state spending into 4 broadly shared value areas. So we can look at everything the state spends money on and identify it with a value that we think is widely shared. So helping people and environment refers to all of the state spending on healthcare, our foster care system, our long-term care system, environmental protection, and then education and opportunity, just as it sounds, it's all of the state's investments in education, everything from early learning, K through 12, through higher education and workforce development. Thriving communities refers to the state's investments in public safety, arts, parks, culture, and then economic security are investments in things like childcare, food assistance, things that help people be economically secure, weather difficult financial times, help them find work. And so our state spends about $34 billion over a 2-year period. And this is how that money is spent. So over half of it goes to education, while the smallest percent, only 3%, goes to economic security. And the way we sustain these investments is through our tax system. And our tax system has weathered some pretty significant declines in the years following the Great Recession. And I think probably everyone in this room is familiar with the budget cuts that have happened in the last few years. And what this next graph shows is the decline in state resources in the wake of the recession. So what you see are losses in dollars compared to 2008 levels after adjusting for inflation. So we saw some significant declines in our revenue. And the primary response to those declines by lawmakers was to enact budget cuts. The other important thing to note here is that we're technically in a recovery. Our revenues are starting to rebound, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we have not returned to pre-recession levels, and we will not return to pre-recession levels until 2017. So our revenues are still pretty depressed. And even though we are starting to rebound and recover some of our resources, it does not disguise the fact that we have a broken revenue system. And what I mean by that is that our revenue system fails to keep pace with our economy. It fails to keep pace with our needs and the investment needs we have in the state. And it's also inequitable. So people with the lowest incomes pay the highest percent as a share of their income in taxes than wealthier folks do. So in terms of the inadequacy, you can really see that in this graph. And hopefully you guys can see this. I know the light's kind of shining down there. But what this shows is revenues as a share of our state economy. So as our economy has grown over time, our resources as a share of that have been shrinking since the mid-90s. And the primary reason for that is the fact that we rely so heavily on our retail sales tax, which does not track well with the economy or the way we spend money. It may have tracked fairly well in the 1930s when we created this tax system, but that was a long time ago, and the economy has changed. As you all probably know, we don't have a state income tax, so nearly half of our revenues come from the retail sales tax, and so it is failing to keep pace with our economy. So to put those two things, a little bit of the context around the revenue system and the budget, into more tangible perspective when we look at the budget for the next biennium. As I had said, our revenues are growing. So the first thing to look at when we look at the budget situation is our resources. So on the resource side of the ledger, we are bringing in almost $3 billion in additional revenue. So this is above the amount of revenue that we have in this current biennium. So I'm looking at the incremental changes. So we have almost $3 billion in additional revenue. And that's important because you're probably going to hear that a lot from some lawmakers who will say, we have $3 billion in more revenue. What's the problem? Well, I will show you what the problem is, which is that on the spending side, to maintain everything we're doing will almost eat up all of our additional resources. And so what that means is that this maintenance cost is just the cost to continue doing business as usual. And we probably all can relate to that because every year in our own personal budgets, rent increases, price of fuel and gas generally increases. So you have inflation and other factors that just make, maintaining the same things more expensive from year to year. The state, on top of that, deals with increases in our population. So we have more kids in classrooms. We have demographic changes that we have to deal with, like the aging of baby boomers. That requires more from our long-term care system. So those factors, just those general cost increases, will almost eat up the entire additional resources.
Where's the additional resources coming from?
From our typical tax sources through retail sales tax, B&O tax, property tax.
And this is a projected additional.
Right. This is based on what the Economic Revenue Forecast Council projects. And by the way, they will update their projection on Friday, so these numbers may change a little, just FYI. But that's not all, because on top of that, we have this thing called McCleary. Has everybody heard of McCleary? Tends to be part of. What's that? McCleary? Have you heard? I was asking if folks know what McCleary is.
The Supreme Court decision.
Yeah, so McCleary is synonymous with the fact that our state has failed to adequately fund our K-12 public schools. And so the state is on the hook both from our state constitutional obligation, which says we need to fully fund K-12 schools, and also from the state Supreme Court, which is now holding the state in contempt and overseeing the progress that the legislature is making. And so by 2018, the legislature needs to have fully funded basic education in the state. And that requires a lot of money. And so we've been phasing that in. So far, the legislature's invested a little over $1 billion towards that goal. And then in the next biennium, these are kind of the minimum things they need to do. They need to make the next investment towards school maintenance and supplies, which is often referred to as the acronym, which is MSOC, but really what this is textbooks, curriculum, science labs, and then all-day kindergarten and lower class sizes in kindergarten through third grade, which those things must be fully funded by the 2017-18 school year. But again, the legislature has to make progress on these things and phase them in. So that's the next phase in amount. There's a question over here.
It's a little light from back there.
Yeah,
What
I
is-
know,
What is
sorry.
the numbers on the third?
So this is all-day kindergarten and lower class sizes in K3 is 520 million. And then the maintenance and supplies is 750 million. So it's 1.2 billion together.
Does that include the class size initiative?
Not yet. Yeah, that's
Oh.
coming right up. So on top of that, we have voter initiatives. So probably most of you have heard of Initiative 732. This is calls for cost of living increases for teachers. This initiative passed the ballot in the year 2000. It has had a history of being suspended by the legislature, and it, in fact, was suspended in this current 2-year budget cycle, but it becomes law again going forward. So it is law for the next biennium, and that's about $240 million. And then we have Initiative 1351, which passed on the ballot in November, which reduces class sizes in kindergarten through 12th grade. So in all the grades, it would reduce class sizes. That comes with a pretty hefty price tag. It's $1.6 billion in the next 2-year budget. And the important thing about that initiative to know as well is that when an initiative passes at the ballot, within the first 2 years of passage, the legislature cannot amend or suspend it unless they have a 2/3 majority vote in both chambers. So it's not an easy thing to do. And so once you put that together, we're looking at least a $3 billion shortfall. And I say at least, and I stress that these are required spending obligations because these are the things legally that the legislature is supposed to fund. But we know that this is not sufficient, that we need to be making investments beyond this. We have collective bargaining agreements that were negotiated between state employees and the governor's office. We should fund those. State employees haven't had a raise in 6 years, so we need to be investing in our state's workforce. That would be on top of this. We all know that we need to make more investment in our mental health system. That would be in addition to this. In addition, we need to start restoring cuts that were made in the last several years and start investing in the things that we all care about. So again, that would be in addition to this. So this is a pretty significant gap as is, $3 billion at a minimum. And it's kind of challenging when you start to think, well, how would you resolve this without increasing the resource side of the ledger? Something that makes that even more challenging is that 2/3 of the budget is protected. And when I say it's protected, what I mean is that we have state constitutional obligations to fund certain things. I already mentioned K-12. That's protected in our state's constitution, and that's a huge part of the state budget. We're also required to pay debt that we owe on the bonds that we take out to build schools and other capital projects. We have to pay that debt. We also have to pay our pension system. And then we have federal legal requirements around things like Medicaid. Medicaid is a state federal match program. So in order for us to get the 50% match from the federal government, we have to maintain that program in a certain way. So in essence, it becomes protected. We also have to provide a certain level of care for children in the foster care system and a level of care for people in institutions like nursing homes. So once you take those things off the table, what you're left with is a third of the budget, or about $11 billion, that is available for cuts. And that includes our entire Department of Corrections, which is about $1.7 billion over 2 years. Our entire higher education system, which is $3 billion over 2 years. And then a large chunk is human services, and that I think is a lot of the things that we all in this room care about. These are things like childcare, food assistance, housing assistance, really the kinds of services that serve the most vulnerable people in our state. And that's often why in the past when we've seen budget proposals that propose to cut a lot of things that would be really tragic for many people, it's because the human service part of the budget is an area where there is significant amount of money that is unprotected. So that makes resolving the budget through cuts very challenging.
Where have all the cuts come in